So thank you for joining, everybody. Greatly appreciate you spending some time with us today. We have a subject matter that is very important to our business community, especially at this time when we look to recover, renew, and rejuvenate how we operate as businesses. And we look to hire back employees, or even possibly hire people from job categories that are no longer available. But an important part of that hiring and retraining is going to be addressing the need for persons with a disability and how they can make a very positive contribution to not only our community, but actually to the way we run our businesses, and how really it's a smart thing to do more so than it is the right thing to do. But obviously that means that we need to really be attentive to Accessibility Act. And part of today is to hear from our experts from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And I want to thank Lisa Kelly for joining us, and also Louis De Palma from the southern regions of this tropical province. And we hope that everybody enjoys today's session, and I'm sure they'll be providing us with lots of resources for consideration. So thanks for joining us, everybody. And Lisa, I understand you are going to be kicking it off.
I am indeed. So let me pull up my deck to get started. Make sure I have the right one. Yes, okay, sorry. I suddenly had a panic thinking I'm on the wrong deck. So thank you very much, Rory and Dawn, for having us here. My name is Lisa Kelly. I'm a programs manager with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and really here to talk to you about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act, or Aoda or Aoda, depending on how you want to say it. But really what it does is help you become an inclusive employer. And at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, we actually think that that will help you be more profitable when you are an inclusive employer. So I'm going to kick off today by talking about the competitive advantage of hiring people with a disability. Because as Rory pointed out, this isn't so much a case of it's a good thing to do. It is a good thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do for your business. It's a smart thing to do. We'll talk about the Aoda, what it is, and then we'll talk to you about this new tool that we have. It's new. It's been around for about 5 years, but we keep improving it. And so we want to encourage more businesses to participate in what we call the Discoverability Network. I'll pause at points so that you can unmute and ask questions, but we'll also be sharing this deck out at the end of the session with hyperlinks in it, with a list of resources for you to go to. So we will be sending that out after. So first of all, what is this Discoverability Network that Louis De Palma, who will be speaking in a few moments, created? It's kind of three parts to it. The first is a job matching platform, and that was created about 4 years ago. And it actually matches you, the employer, to what we think is a really great talent pool, which is people with disabilities. So our job matching platform connects you to job seekers with a disability. Okay, and everybody on our system, when you use our filters, has a disability, but also has the qualities and abilities you're looking for. So you're going to get matched to people who can meet your business and workforce needs. So qualified talent, they just happen to have a disability. We also offer free training in support of that platform. So we understand that hiring a person with a disability isn't necessarily hard. It's not necessarily easy, but it's different. So that said, sometimes we need training on what those differences might be and how we can do things differently. So the Chamber is committed to providing training on disability, inclusive recruitment practices, how to encourage disclosure in the workplace, on accommodations, on the Aoda, even on language, what's appropriate language. So a whole bunch of topics. You just need to reach out to me. My contact information is at the end of this deck, and we can set you up with that. The third thing that we do is create networking events. a chance for you to meet qualified candidates, perhaps, identify a few that you might want to encourage to apply to your organization, but also build up your confidence in working with a wide variety of candidates with disabilities. Because when you've worked with one person with a disability, you've worked with one person with a disability. So it's not going to be the same each and every time. Just like all humans, we have a real array, a continuum of abilities that's constantly changing. So we have to be open to that. So hiring people with disabilities isn't just the right thing to do, it's a good thing to do for business. So some facts. 77% of small businesses, according to a Bank of Montreal survey in 2014, who've hired people with disabilities, said they met or exceeded expectations. That's a really high number. And that's business talking to business. It's not me trying to sell you something, it's not the government, it's actually business talking to business about the realities of recruitment and retention, okay? In terms of productivities, SMEs with employees with disabilities report they meet or exceed those productivity expectations. Usually I get a comment then something about, but it costs a lot, doesn't it? And that's a valid concern. We're businesses, we want to be profitable. First of all, not everybody that has a disability asks for an accommodation. Okay, there's lots of people with disabilities that never disclose that they have a disability, and they don't require an accommodation. For the first 30 years of my working life, I did not require an accommodation. So I never felt it was important that I disclose. 60% of accommodations, when you do supply them, cost nothing. They're absolutely free, okay? Might be something like moving someone's desk closer to a washroom. It might be flexibility around coffee time. It might be allowing someone to stand up and stretch. It might be giving them feedback in a written format versus in a face-to-face conversation. So it doesn't cost you anything. The next 33% of accommodations are a single cost of less than $500. That's pretty negligible when you think that people with disabilities tend to stay in the jobs longer, up to 72% higher retention, okay? So you also are giving accommodations all the time to other individuals. So 95% of accommodations that are supplied in the workplace are not related to disability. They're related to family leave or personal leave. So we're used to making changes. Oh yeah, Dawn, come in late or leave a little bit earlier because perhaps Dawn has to pick up a child at school. There's an accommodation, right? We're very good at this. So you should already feel like you're an expert in accommodations. You do this all the time. Everybody's unique. Everybody has changing situations. And then understand that even when we give an accommodation to a person that's not related to disability, there's a cost associated with that as well. I think it's $300. So that's a $200 difference. And not everyone with a disability is going to require an accommodation. Finally, we're here to help you with capacity, connecting to the talent, training you where you feel that there's areas we can help you improve, and supporting you if you have any questions. Key benefits. I mentioned retention, up to 72% higher staff retention. That's going to save millions of dollars in recruitment and training costs if you're a really large business, perhaps thousands, but it's all profit in your pocket. Productivity. Employees with disabilities actually rate average or better on productivity and job performance. They rate average or better on attendance than people without disabilities. And they rate significantly, 98%, average or better on safety. So we're asking you to consider a talent pool that has the skills you need to do the job, that are going to stay longer, be as or more productive, attend work better, as well as or better than your employees without disabilities, and who are going to work more safely. The second thing, and I think this point doesn't come up enough, is that when we hire people with disabilities, they often bring perspectives and insights into our services or our products or how we do things that can be a competitive advantage. My favorite example of this is the company Good Grips, the kitchen utensil company, OXO Good Grips. And the owner of the company actually, when his wife developed arthritis, asked his design company to create a better grip, a handle on all their kitchen utensils so that she might hold that. That's now developed into an award-winning and one of the largest kitchen utensil companies in the world. And it's all driven by the fact that his wife had a difference, how she holds things, and he solved for that, but everybody uses that solution. The AODA, and I'm going to turn it over to Louis, so I'm giving him a heads up. The AODA is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act. Louis, do you call it the AODA or Aoda?
I call it AODA.
Yeah, me too. Okay.
Aoda to me sounds like I'm talking to someone in Star Wars.
Well, that's not a bad thing. But yes, I call it the AODA, but whatever you call it, it is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and its goal is to reach an accessible Ontario by 2025. How? Well, there's five accessibility standards that you have to meet. They're rules that you should follow that help prevent and remove barriers for people with disabilities. And it applies to organizations and business in Ontario that provide goods or services. Louis, I'm going to let you kick off. Do you want to add anything else here before I go to the next slide?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is I'll just mention that it applies to organizations that have one or more employees. So if you're a consultant and you're a partnership or you're not incorporated, you wouldn't necessarily be considered as an employee because you're the owner operator. If you are the same consultant, let's say a one-person shop, and you do incorporate, at that point you're captured because now you're technically an employee of your corporation. So there's a slight distinction there. But
and Louis, Louis, are the standards the same for everyone? Say if you have one employee or 50 employees, is it the same?
No,
for
50 is a cutoff number. It's a number where, depending on which standard, the company is held to a higher obligation. And the higher obligations really relate to codifying practices into policies, as opposed to just having a practice. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get through some of the other slides. The other thing about the Act does not prescribe what you need to do in every particular situation. What it does, it lays out a framework that you can follow to develop your own solutions to whatever you need to respond to in the workplace, whether you're dealing with a customer, whether you're dealing with an employee, whether you're dealing with a prospective employee. So as you can see on the slide there's 5 areas that we need to be aware of. You're probably all very aware with the customer service standard. Just a show of hands, everyone understands the customer service standard because it's in play for a long time. Okay, so as you know, you need to have some policies and practices around customer service, and the whole idea is to be able to provide that service to persons with disabilities, just like you would provide to any other demographic in your community. The other one is the information and communication standards, and it really speaks to how we share and convey information. The one is really the one that is the latest that's come out that has a lot of requirements in it is the employment standard. The employment standard really speaks to what we need to do as organizations or companies right from the point where we're starting the recruitment process, to the hiring process, to the onboarding process, and to the whole employment process, is what is the obligation on the employer when it comes to working or hiring people with disabilities. And that's not just a new employee, it's existing employees. Because what happens is when I was younger, I had everything going for me in terms of, how I could move, how I thought, I didn't have arthritis, I didn't have any pains in my back, and so on and so on and so on. As I get older, what I find is that I change. So unless I'm extremely lucky or people are extremely lucky, you might fall into that category of having some form of disability simply because we slow down, our senses change. It's as simple as that. So it applies to those existing employees. So again, when we talk about disabilities and we talk about accommodation, it's not just about trying to recruit talent from a different talent pool to meet the needs of your organization. It's also about retaining your existing talent. Because if we don't provide those accommodations, then the likelihood that I'm going to stay longer at your business is diminished. Whereas if I'm being accommodated, then I'm going to be able to stay longer and still provide that good service to you as a company and maintain that corporate memory. The other one is transportation, which really speaks to taxi services and government-run transportation services. I don't know if there's anyone on the call that would be involved in running any of those. Generally, they're not, unless you're running some kind of transportation service or a taxi service. If anyone is, let me know. Generally not. Okay. The other one speaks to design of public spaces, and this is a pretty technical standard. And it speaks to things like trails, marinas, parks, think of a space, the public space that people go to. It also speaks to service counters, the heights of service counters. And really what you need to know about that is it speaks to brand new operations or brand new buildings or brand new trails and parks and so on. However, if you're doing a major overhaul, let's say, so if you're a volunteer organization and you're maintaining one of the local trails, and what you find is you want to do a major overhaul of that trail, at that point, you may get captured by the updated requirements in the design of public spaces. So like I say, that's fairly technical. So if you need some information about that, if you're ever involved in that, we're happy to help you with that. Obviously, there's many barriers when it comes to working with and employing people with disabilities. Information and communications is one of them. Really, it's important to understand how should we communicate. So we don't make assumptions because disabilities are both visible and invisible. So really the first thing is to determine is what's the best form of communication once you realize that the traditional forms of communication don't seem to be working. Perhaps the individual may signal that, perhaps you may pick that up in your initial contact with them. Best way is, I always say ATP, ask the person. That's the best way. Find out from them. They can tell you how to best communicate. And again, the legislation doesn't say to us as employers, this is how you're going to deal with it. What the legislation says is figure out the best form of communication to accommodate that individual.
Can I interject here? So
Sure.
really is the design of the legislation to break these barriers down, and that's why you have those standards.
Exactly. And if you talk to people, what I say, what the legislation does, if you're trying to break down some barriers in your workspace, that what I call unintended barriers, because I don't believe people wake up in the morning and deliberately say, I think today I'm going to create a barrier for somebody. I don't believe people do that. We have a great civil society here in Ontario, and we're always willing to help each other. So what happens is, because we have to organize our workspaces in a certain way, because we have to have policies and practices to make sure that we're efficient, sometimes what happens, we create an inadvertent barrier. And that's really what this is about. It's about getting rid of those barriers or taking a look and proactively looking at those barriers so that everyone has an equal opportunity in the workplace, and also if you're a customer of an organization. But the biggest barrier generally, though, is attitudes. And the attitudes really comes down to people just aren't aware. It's an awareness issue. And that's why, many organizations are out there, providing webinars like this, and prior to COVID, live events, just sharing information, education. Because when you don't know something, I know when I don't know something, I make it up. And I know when I make something up, I invariably get it wrong. So the more we know and the more we share, and I can tell you, my spouse reminds me of that many, many times, okay? So I've learned over the years that I should inform myself about something before I come to some kind of conclusion. So that's why, we're one of the reasons why we're doing this, and why we started this. Actually, we started this when the act was first brought into place many, many years ago, because companies were saying to us, we're not aware we don't understand. Can you help us understand? Because we're being told that all kinds of things that we need to do as businesses. So we actually started the program of talking to businesses so we could dispel some of the myths around what was the requirement for businesses. Because businesses were being, they were receiving phone calls. They were having salespeople come to their place and say, as part of the AODA, you better have a door opener on there. And by the way, I'm a door opener salesman, okay, automatic door opener salesman. And so we went out and we started saying, under this piece of legislation, that's not a requirement. So after doing many, we've probably done about 350 live presentations. And I know when Lisa joined, I know she's probably up to 200 virtual presentations now. We're certainly trying to spread the word to kind of reduce that awareness issue, because I think the more we're aware, the more we'll see how the demographic in our communities can really help our businesses grow and prosper. I see the next slide has come up here as customer service standard. Really, that's all about, it deals with how you deal with customers. It deals with service animals. It deals with temporary disruptions, providing customer feedback, which you would do for any customer. I always try and point out that, when I go through some of these things, requirements, it really speaks to what we do for any individual. Okay. So it's good to have good customer feedback. Again, it's take a look at the way you're communicating. When it comes to service animals, what you need to know essentially is service animal can go anywhere. Okay. Provided they're not going somewhere where another piece of legislation prohibits them from doing so. Okay.
So Louis, would an example of that be, you don't have to let a service animal into a kitchen?
Exactly. There is there's a health act that says, certainly the service animal can come into a restaurant with a person with a disability, but they can't go into the kitchen. So if for some reason, let's say you had a health inspector, I'll give you an example of how you would work around that issue. If you had a health inspector that required a service animal in your local municipality, and they needed to go into that kitchen to take some swabs, you wouldn't let the dog into the kitchen because there's another piece of legislation that says that you can't, okay? But you would then make an arrangement with the individual to give them access to the kitchen. And at that point in time, the service animal would be put in a safe place. They would conduct their business with your assistance. You would again ask the person, how can you best accommodate that? And then reunite them with the service animal. You just wouldn't say, well, we're sorry, your service animal can't come, therefore you can't come into my kitchen. That's not what the spirit of the legislation. The spirit of the legislation is to try and help allow people do what they need to do, whether they're an employee or a customer. Okay.
Louis, what's an accessible format? Because I see that's on the bottom. So what might that be?
It could be larger font size. It could be that if someone comes in and they might have some form of hearing impairment, they might be deaf. So what you're going to do is you're going to communicate with a written pad, or through a computer. It's really, the whole key is to try and determine what the best format is given your circumstances. So again, ask the person in whichever way you can when you have the contact so that you can figure that out. It doesn't have to be high tech, even though, and Lisa, you can speak to a little bit about this, the high tech things that, we have already on our computers right now. Many of us are using, Microsoft suite of services, which do all kinds of things. And Lisa, maybe you could just speak a little bit to that, because I know companies often ask, yeah, but this is really expensive, to get into some technology to provide an accommodation. Maybe you can just talk about what's already there.
Yeah, so a lot of service providers and businesses are actually making tools accessible. So a great example is Microsoft's whole suite of Microsoft Teams has free closed captions. So you can automatically access free closed captions if you set up a team meeting. Zoom, you can access accessible captioning by just contacting them on a one-off basis, or you can get a subscription monthly, and it can be as low as $6. So again, very, very inexpensive. Microsoft Word actually has built-in accessibility features, and if you use them, the document is actually clearer because it forces you to use structures like an outline structure, basically. And it's already done for you. It's not that difficult. Learning it can be a bit tricky. That's one of the things we actually offer training on. PowerPoint as well, easy. And once you have an accessible PowerPoint and an accessible Word, you have an accessible PDF. So there's a lot of free things out there already. If you have a video, you know, you would ideally caption it, but if you can't, then you can just send out a transcript. That's an accommodation. So it doesn't have to be a high-tech solution. But, you know, in some cases, if you hire somebody with, for instance, a sensory disability, so maybe they're deaf or blind, you might have to put in voice to text or text to voice software, which is readily available at a good price, like JAWS is an example of that.
So Lisa's talked about many of the things that, you know, you could utilize to meet this information communication standards. The key again is decide what's the best way to communicate, make sure the communication is well received and understood. And why wouldn't we want to do that with any employee? At the end of the day, when we're talking to our employees, we want to make sure they understand what we're asking of them, and we understand what their needs are so that they can better perform their job functions in our organization. The other thing under the information communication standard, if you have 50 or more employees, this is that number of 50 we talked about earlier, you have to be, your website has to be in compliance with what's called WCAG guidelines 2.0 level AA. I'm not a tech person, but I can tell you that if you're, you know, updating your website, or if you're creating a new website, when you're talking to your web developer, they will know all about this standard, and they will automatically build it into your website enhancement or development. So it's just something you need to be aware of. I believe that the requirement for companies 50 or more, this year it was January 1st. You have to have that WCAG compliance with your website. And there is a reporting requirement on June the 30th, where any company with 20 or more employees will be required to report. I think it's every 2 years they do a reporting. They extended the reporting deadline from last year, which was supposed to be up till March 31st. Because of COVID, they extended it to June 30th of 2021. So be aware of that. The only other thing I would suggest when it comes to information, have regard for color contrast. Many times you may put out flyers, or you may put out some you know, when you're creating a website, you have wonderful colors in there, but if the colors bleed into each other, it's very difficult to read, very difficult to convey the information you're trying to convey. Okay.
Yeah, I would say, Louis, too, size of font and just use of white space are also really good practices. So you don't want to have all these words up on the screen in the yellow that we use for the dot over on the left-hand side. It's not enough color contrast. So black, white is great. So, you know, you want things to stand out. Employment standard, Louis.
This is the employment standard. This is the one that we really have to have some regard for, because we all have employees if we're, you know, run a business or manage a business, and we all recruit from time to time. So you can see there on the slide, there's a difference between having less than 50 and more than 50. Essentially, it's the same thing. You have to do the same, you have the same requirements to deal with. There is a couple of extra. Not only, you know, it says there are 50 plus, it says accommodation plans, it says about return to work process. It means that you have to have a codified process. It doesn't mean that a company with less than 50 doesn't have to accommodate someone with a disability. It just means they don't have to have a codified process to do that. So this is really important, this 50 or more. What we tell all companies when they ask us, you know, what's the best practice? So even if you have less than 50, the best practice is to write things down, have policies that speak to these things. You know, and then when I start telling people about the policies that you need to create, you know, unless you have a policy gene, and I don't have a policy gene, it becomes daunting. You know, it really becomes daunting to create these policies. The good news is this. The good news is if you go to some websites that are described, you know, later on in the slide deck, or you go to the Discoverability Network, which is our website, all those templates are there for you. They've already been created, whether it's in the recruitment space, whether it's workplace information, whether it's about accommodation plans and how to create them, return to work process. There's great templates there. You can just take them, read them, apply them to your business, and then remember to train your staff. It's extremely important that you train your staff in these areas. And it's also extremely important as part of this standard that when you're hiring and recruiting, you let that be known during the whole recruiting process that you are an accommodating employer. So when you place your ad, there should be a tagline you put on the bottom that says, you know, we're an accommodating employer. And if you need any type of accommodation throughout the recruitment process, let us know. So what you should do when you're setting up your interviews, even though you may not have yet been asked, have regard for, you know, how that interview is being set up. Make sure that it's in an accessible space. Make sure that, you know, how you're asking questions can be modified. Make sure that you have various formats of perhaps asking those questions if you're asked. Okay, so this is something just to get ahead of it. In addition, you know, when you're at, let me give you an example of an accommodation during the recruiting process. So you've screened your applicants, you've decided to recruit or to interview 10 people. And someone says to you, gee, you know, instead of the 30-minute interview, is it possible to extend that interview to 45 minutes or an hour? Okay. So that would be a form of an accommodation request. And that's something that we would suggest that you would do, because what you're really trying to figure out is what kind of information and knowledge and skill sets does this individual have? If it takes them a little longer to convey to you, it's probably to our advantage as businesses to find out what exactly this person can do, so that we might want to hire them. Another thing might be, you know, if for some reason, you know, you're holding the, and you like we would, if we were in our office, I would hold that interview, you know, where we are on the 15th floor. So if perhaps, you know, the elevators didn't work that day and someone with a physical disability couldn't get to our office, you know, because they shut down for an hour or two, we'd make arrangements somewhere else to hold that interview. Or if we're on the second floor that doesn't have an elevator, let me give you that example. That's a better one. You wouldn't just say, well, we're sorry, you know, we can't interview you because we're on the second floor, you can't get to us. You would make an alternative arrangement to interview that person in a place where they have access to the space. So really important that, you know, use a computer. You may have to use written, you know, you might have to communicate by writing things down. You might, you know, have to take a look at your job descriptions. I got to tell you, job descriptions are some of the biggest barriers out there, inadvertent barriers, because this is what we all do, okay? When we hire someone, we all go into our drawer. Now it's an electronic drawer, and we pull out the last time we hired somebody, and we take that job ad, and then we modify it and push it out again. And unfortunately, that's been happening for the last 20 years, you know, in organizations that have been around a long time. So what you get is you get these job ads, which are really don't meet the requirements of the position. They meet some of the requirements of the position, but it's like asking for the moon when you don't really need the moon. And so take a look at those job ads, make sure they actually meet the requirements of what you need. How many of us have seen job ads where it's an entry-level position, but you need 3 or 4 years experience? I scratch my head when I see that, because clearly you're eliminating a whole bunch of folks that you're actually looking to recruit. So really important, take a look at those job ads. You know, we talked a little bit about accessible formats and supports, so I won't get into more, into much more, but I see, is that a question coming through? There's a question there I saw, Lisa. I'm not fast enough with my eyes, but maybe we can deal with it before we're done, okay? The other one is creating accommodation plans. This is the one, again, that gives some folks angst simply because of awareness or lack of understanding of how to create an accommodation. So what the Act does do, it says to you, this is the process that you must follow to create an accommodation. It doesn't tell you what the accommodation should be. It goes through the steps. So what do you do first? The first thing is you ask the individual. You find out what their needs are. You don't ask them what their disability is. That we all know that that's not allowed. What you ask is, so what is it that you're asking me? What is the accommodation? What are the needs? How can I meet those needs? And then what you do, you go through the step process and you come up with an accommodation plan with that individual that makes sense for you as an organization and for them as an individual. Accommodation does not mean that you're lowering your standards as an employer. I think that's a key thing, a question that I get all the time. The individual still needs to perform the functions of the position. Okay, it's what you're doing is you're allowing them to perform the functions of a position in a different way. You know, a simple example could be, you know, I might be working on an assembly line, and I might be right-handed and extremely proficient with that right hand, but my left hand just doesn't work as well as my right hand. So I'm not keeping up, you know, with the line. However, if you kind of switched me around and put me on the other side of the line, you know, where I could use my hand that I'm more proficient with, I'm just as competent and can work just as fast and maybe even more so than anybody else. Very simple accommodation process there. You know, Lisa talked about it earlier. You know, I remember this is a live case, actually a live case study where an individual was being monitored by their employer and their manager because the individual kept leaving their desk. Okay, and they had no idea. They would turn around and say, okay, well, where's Louis? You know, Louis's gone. They had no idea where Louis was. So it got to the point where they were really moving towards discipline with this individual, and someone decided, gee, you know, maybe we should have a conversation with them and say, you know, what's going on? How can we help? And what they found out was she had a disability, and what she really needed to do to manage her disability, she needed to take a more frequent break. So she needs to get away, pull herself away from that computer, away from the desk, away from the work environment, and she would go for a 5 or 10-minute walk. So once they understood that, they worked out an arrangement with her. She still performed the duties. She still got all her work done, but from time to time she would go, and everyone understood that that was something that person had to do. Another live example is a company that's a welding company, fairly large, and they had good welder, great welder, and all of a sudden productivity dropped considerably, and company couldn't understand. Eventually they had a conversation with the individual. What they found out, the individual had hurt their back outside of the workplace and wasn't flexible anymore and couldn't bend over to do the welding like they used to do. So what they did, they actually called in someone to look at what could they do for this individual in terms of a chair of some sort to help this individual. And they bought a chair for under $500. And once they bought this person this special chair, got right back to being a highly productive employee. So just important that why accommodation is important, not only to the individual, but also to the employer, because you certainly don't want to lose valuable employees like that because we're not aware that they require some kind of accommodation. Okay. Of course, the plans need to be confidential, absolutely confidential and secured, and you need to change them from time to time when either there's a change in the work practices in the workplace, or maybe when the accommodation, the needs of the person you're accommodating change. So you always try to have a review mechanism built into those plans, okay? Are there any questions about accommodation? Because usually that's where we get
Yes,
a lot.
Louis, we have one here. If someone requires an interpreter, who's responsible for providing that during the interview?
Okay, so the first question I have is the interpreter the only way to accommodate that individual? Yeah. So this is something that's important to take a look at, right? So is there another way to accommodate? Because of course, when you're involving interpreters, and if it comes to the point where there's an interpreter, there are some service organizations out there that will provide interpreter services. But before we get to that, or before the employer starts to hire an interpreter, the idea really is to ask the person, figure out what is a good way to communicate. It doesn't necessarily need to be the interpreter. And I can give you another live example that happened with a municipality where they were running a course. Okay, they were running a program. And in the program, they would bring a whole bunch of people in, and the people would get whatever the course they were running. And one of the individuals that was signed up for the course had sensitivities to certain types of perfumes. Okay. So what the municipality did actually said to them, listen, what we will do, we will run the course for you on your own, which is a great accommodation. Okay. The individual insisted that everybody else, shouldn't, and this is years ago, and I know this thinking has now changed, but years ago, the individual insisted that no, that didn't work for them. They wanted another form of accommodation. Now, I never did hear the outcome of all of that, but essentially, the offer that the municipality made was absolutely great under this piece of legislation, because they're offering that accommodation. You can't come in with everybody else. We're giving you the same course on your own. Nothing should be problematic. So you don't have to settle for what what people say they want until you explore. And if that's what you settle on, that's terrific. But just be aware that is that back and forth between the employee, the prospective employee, and the organization. Ask the person and come up with what makes sense for both of you. If you get to the point where you can't accommodate, you've gone through the process, you've gone through the steps, you've done a needs analysis with them. You may have, with their permission, spoken to their doctor, just to find out what they can and can't do. You've taken a look at your process in your workplace, and you just can't accommodate. What we suggest is obviously seek outside advice before you provide that final information to that employee that you're not going to accommodate them, because you never know whether that becomes something that you might engage in some kind of complaint. So you want to really touch base with someone from outside of your organization just to get that extra advice in case that happess to you. So I hope that answers the question about the interview.
Yeah, so let's recap on that, because that's a lot of great information.
Sorry, I guess it just came out of me there.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of great information. So number one, you would ask the individual where the gap is. So if it's, to your point, ask them what they need and they're saying interpreter, it might be that closed captions would work and you could do the interview over Skype or with closed captions or Teams, right? If they do absolutely need an interpreter, the employer's responsible for that? Yes?
Yeah, I would say if you're at the point where you absolutely need an interpreter, you're going to have to make a decision whether you're going to provide that accommodation or not.
Yeah.
That's an employer decision. If you decide you're going to provide that accommodation, then you can seek sources of payment for that interpreter. I would suspect, though, that in 99% of the cases, there's another way to accommodate that request.
Yeah, I would as well. And then you said you might be at some point be able to speak to a medical professional about what's needed for the accommodation, but that does not include a diagnosis or personal details of the person's medical history, correct?
Exactly, absolutely not, or anything to do with what their disability is. It really comes down to what are their, you've heard of these functional needs analysis. That's really what it comes down to. What can I do as an employee? What can I not do as an employee? So you as an employer, so for instance, if I'm in a job where that requires some kind of physical lifting, and I can't lift anything more than 50 pounds, and that's what we get from the needs analysis that we do, then as the employer, and as part of my accommodation, I would assign work to that individual where they don't have to lift anything more than 50 pounds. Okay, so as an example, again, but you can't ask me what my disability is.
Right.
You can only ask me, what can't I do?
So I'm going to use the example between you and I, because I work for you. And I came to Louis and said, after about a week of working at the OCC, I said, Louis, this environment is overwhelming to me. Can I have my own office? And Louis said, no, rightfully so.
Yeah, I said, no, you can't.
I wanted to shoot for the moon. And it was a discussion. So then Louis asked me, well, what do you need, Lisa? What's the real problem here? And I said, it's really noisy and frenetic, and I'm finding it hard to do my work. And so Louis introduced me to these really cool things that you can use called noise canceling headsets, that it turns out everybody in our office uses, because it's not only somebody with a disability who finds it overwhelming, it's everyone. And that's a really good example of how, a lot of times my first thought was, I'm going to have a private office, not because I really wanted to take Rocco's office or Louis', but just because it didn't occur to me that noise canceling headsets would work. And Louis was able to straighten me out on that. And we still have a great relationship because it gave me the ability to do my job.
Yeah, and I wasn't as blunt as Lisa says it, okay? I was very kind and gentle. And I
wasn't as blunt asking.
That's right. I went through the process and I asked the person, what it really is that your needs are and how can I help, essentially. Okay, and that's how we arrived at that.
Exactly. And then I think that another really interesting part is you should document that, right? Because that's an agreement for both of us, so that I have an understanding of what you've agreed to and you as the employer have an understanding. And we can both refer back to that, which is, I think, this next slide, which is it's really important to have a process where you just write it down. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's just Lisa requires a set of noise canceling headsets.
Yeah, and remember I talked about the steps that you need to follow? This is actually what's prescribed. So on this slide, if you follow these steps to arrive at an accommodation, you're actually meeting the requirements of the ODA. Okay, so these are the steps that you would go through. And you see, I've already highlighted some of them if you read them. And the whole idea is, again, if you get to that end point where you're going to deny. So if at some point I would have said to Lisa, after whatever Lisa asked me, let's say it was a different type of accommodation, and I couldn't have, my organization certainly didn't have the wherewithal to do that, then I would have had to say to Lisa, I'm sorry, Lisa, I can't accommodate you. I can't do this. Believe me, I would have checked with some outside advisor or counsel before I came to that conclusion. Okay, because I don't want to get embroiled in something if I haven't really checked it out as thorough as I possibly can. Okay. So again, this slide again speaks to accommodations and how it really helps, increase productivity. There's something else when we talk about accommodation you might want to have a consideration of. It's the job carving piece. So, sometimes what it is you can take a job and you can give me part of that job that really needs to be done, and maybe part of another job that really needs to be done. So I have a full job there, but I'm doing something that I can absolutely do. And then you shift off the other pieces to another employee. And I've done that on a number of occasions in different places of employment I've been in. I got to tell you, it works really, really great, because what you end up with is good employees on both sides of the equation. They're doing what they like, and the other one is getting to do what they can do. So it really works really well. So take a look at that. But again, the essential duties of the position must be performed. That's just the way it is. So if I'm a lineman and I have to climb, the hydro tower to do my job, if I can't climb the hydro tower to do my job, I can go to my employer and ask for an accommodation, but it's not going to be, in climbing the hydro tower. They may have to do something else for me within my place of employment to accommodate me, because, if you're out in the bush and there aren't any cherry pickers that I can, you can carry me up to the top to do my job, then, you're going to have to accommodate me, or take a look at it, could not have to accommodate me, but try and determine if you can accommodate me in a different way. Okay. Emergency response. This is important to keep your employees safe, extremely important. Whenever we become aware as an employer that one of our employees needs an emergency response plan developed, we go through the process. We ask the individual. You can see 4 simple questions that you need to ask yourself and the individual. How will the individual know that there's an emergency? Do they know where to go if there's an emergency? Is the way out accessible? And if there's any support needed, what is that support? These plans are confidential, can't be shared with anybody. However, with the permission of the individual, you can share it with individuals in your office that are providing the support for that person with a disability. I can give you an example. Some folks are deaf, they can't hear fire alarms. Not every building is equipped with dual fire alarms. So if that's the case, we have an obligation to create an emergency response plan for that individual. So how would we do it? When the alarm goes off, you're obviously going to buddy them up with somebody so that they know that when that alarm sounds, there is an emergency in the building. Okay, and then they know how to activate and move out of the building. So you would say, okay, Louis, can you be the support person for this individual? And then when I'm not there, you're going to have some backup people if I'm away. Because what you don't want is that individual, not hearing the alarm and then staying at their workplace and workstation, and then other people leaving the building. So that's just a quick example of when you would put one of those plans into place. Return to work. Businesses have been doing this for a long time. I know I started doing this in the 80s in the job I was in. And why did we do it? Because it really was good for business. Let me tell you, we had people go off on long-term disability or short-term disability. Our primary concern was how could we get that individual back to work as quickly as possible so that we weren't paying out salary to that individual or premiums for that individual, and then backfilling with time and a half and double time. Because it was a job that I was in. They were fixed post positions. When people weren't there, it cost us money. So what we did is we developed return to work processes way before this piece of legislation, because it was good for business. And it's as it says, you need to create a process for those individuals that are gone because of a disability. You have to develop the steps for how do you facilitate the return of work for that individual back to your workplace and create that accommodation plan. Again, This is something, there's a template on this. It's on discoverability.network. You can go there, you can pull the template down, and you can use it for your own organization. Okay. Accessible spaces and building. This is a bit, I talked a bit earlier about, service counters and outdoor spaces. What we really need to know about accessible spaces and building in the AODA is this. Other than the design of public spaces standard, the AODA does not speak to buildings. Okay, so it doesn't say anywhere in there in the AODA that you should have an accessible bathroom. It doesn't say in there that you have to have automatic door openers. That is guided by the Ontario Building Code. And the Ontario Building Code was updated, I think, 2 years ago, January, a couple of years ago. And what it speaks to in the building code, it speaks to new construction. The building code doesn't speak to the existing buildings. So it doesn't say that all buildings by such and such a day will all have elevators. It doesn't say, all buildings by such and such a day will all have ramps. That's not what it says. What it says is when you're building there are certain standards like that you have to have regard for, whether it's accessible bathrooms, ramps, door openers, those kinds of things. However, if you're in an existing building that doesn't have that, you're not obligated to automatically go and put them in. Where you do have some obligation is this: if you do a major renovation to your building, and when you go seek your building permit that doesn't comply to the latest building code, your building department will tell you whether when you're doing that renovation, you're going to have to upgrade it to the latest building code. So seek their advice, seek their counsel, and then you will know whether your renovation elevates you to the latest existing code. And quick example, used to own a restaurant. When we first bought the restaurant, we put in a new carpet, went to the building department, no problem. We didn't have to upgrade to the latest building code. Later on, we switched the restaurant into a bar. We gutted the whole thing. At that point, the interior of that space that we rented had to comply with the latest building code. And that's what the folks told us at the building department. On the Discoverability Network, and maybe Lisa, do you want to speak to this piece, or do you want me to keep going?
Sure, I can mention this. So we do have a roadmap. I put the link in here directly. And as Louis said, there's lots of tools and examples, as well as curated best practices that we've made available for you. So how to find talent, how to interview and hire. There's things like, how to structure, ask better interview questions, alternate forms of interviewing, onboarding, some tips on that. Accommodations, we've got the individualized accommodation plans up there, examples. So all of the tools are up there. If you can't find one, Louis or I will hunt it down for you and find an example.
There's one thing I forgot to mention, Lisa, because the slide switched on the building code, and this is important. Even though you may not be captured by the latest building code, there is an interplay between the building code, the AODA, and the Ontario Human Rights Code. Okay, so if you're one of these curbside businesses that has those lips entering into your business, and someone who has some kind of mobility disability can't get into your storefront, let's say, because of this curbside lip, if they were to file a complaint against you as a business because of inaccessible way of getting into your building or your storefront, the Ontario Human Codes Commission, if they take up that complaint, they may rule against you from a human rights perspective, not necessarily a building code perspective or an AODA perspective. So understand that even though, I said to you, the AODA doesn't compel you to do this, and the building code may not, if you're in an older building, compel you to do this. If you have a complaint filed against you, the Ontario Human Rights Commission may compel you to do that. And that's a real live case, by the way. There is a community in Ontario, and now there's probably several more, where some individuals made some complaints against some storefront operations, and they actually did receive a judgment against them for not having a ramp. And as you can appreciate, it's difficult in some communities because there's standards for ramps. They have to be, depending on the height of the lip, they have to be so many feet out from the doorway, which may take up the entire sidewalk, right? Which becomes problematic. But they did get a ruling against them, and they had to put in the ramps. And there was also a fine that was received by those businesses. So what you see now is you see a lot of these small stopgap ramps that aren't necessarily to code, but people don't really complain about them because you can put them in quickly. You can get someone into your storefront, and then you can take them down afterwards.
Yeah,
So
there's
just be aware of
free
that.
plans for how to build those. So yeah, it's a good solution. Okay, so if you want to use our portal, you would go to sue.discoverability.network and you access the website as a business. You can access the resources and tools right here under resources. Under what you need to start hiring, down here on the bottom of the screen, there's a link is to the roadmap. And then, or you can start here on the blue, will lead you to the roadmap, and then find talent. That's to sign up for the job board. Simply select the yellow button on the upper right-hand side. There's a list of resources that I'm going to share with you and my contact information. So that's it for us. Rory, are there any other questions?
Oh, great. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to unmute and ask away. We have a quiet bunch with us today, and you guys did an amazing job.
Well, thank you very much for allowing us to come and talk about this. Thank you, Louis, for an excellent presentation. And please feel free to reach out to us. I'll send Rory the materials. I assume he'll distribute them, but if you have any questions, let me know.
Yep, and obviously you can go to our website, ssmcoc.com, and we have a page there for discoverability as well.
Great.
And you know, Rory, when this COVID subsides, you know I'm coming to the Soo again, right? You know that.
You betcha.
That's a given. That's a given.
You should have come this winter. We hardly have any snow.
Because I might have more than you. I got about a foot in my yard.
You do have more than we do. It's surprising. Anyways, well, thank you very much, everybody. Everybody enjoy the rest of the day, and we will provide copies of the material, and also we have recorded today. We'll provide that as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks again very much, Louis. Thank you, Lisa.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.